Take a look at this campground. This was a campground in a densely wooded area of Oklahoma. On the morning of June 13th, 1977, a camp counselor was walking through the campground when she noticed something strange up ahead on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what she was looking at, but when she could, the discovery would be one of the most gruesome and horrifying incidents in Oklahoma history. And although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. Camp Scott sat just outside the small town of Locust Grove, Oklahoma, on a stretch of land where the trees were thick and the outside world seemed distant. The camp had been around for decades by 1977, and over time it had built a reputation as a safe and trusted destination for Girl Scouts across the region. For many families, sending their daughters to Camp Scott was like a tradition. It was a place where kids could spend a couple of weeks outdoors, meet new friends, and come home with stories about nights around the campfire and days full of small adventures. The property itself was large and heavily wooded, with walking trails through the trees and small clearings where different parts of the camp had been set up. And instead of one central cluster of buildings, everything was spread out across the 400-acre property. Campers were divided into smaller groups, and each group was assigned to its own section of the camp. Those sections were called units, and each one had its name, its own set of tents, and a counselor nearby to keep an eye on things. The tents themselves weren't much more than canvas stretched over wooden platforms. Then inside, each had 4 cots and just enough room for a handful of girls to sleep and keep their belongings. It was simple, but that was all really part of the appeal. The whole experience was meant to be a little removed from everyday life. Each unit was also arranged so that the tents sat in a loose row or curve, with the counselor's tent positioned close enough to monitor things. This helped to create a balance where the girls felt like they had space on their own, but there was also supervision within reach. Now, one of these units, called Kiowa, sat a bit further back into the trees than some of the others. It wasn't dramatically isolated, but it was just far enough removed that it felt quieter and more secluded. The terrain there was also uneven, and the trees grew thick enough in some places to block parts of the unit from view. The camp's shower area also sat nearby, adding another layer of separation between Kiowa and the rest of the activity. At the end of this unit was tent number 8, and like every other one in the camp, it was plain and functional. If you walked past it during the day, you wouldn't have given it a second thought, and until June 13th, 1977, there was no reason to. A couple of months before that day, though, Camp Scott was already in use, not for kids yet, but for training. Counselors had gathered at the site in April to get ready for the upcoming season, and it was supposed to be a rather routine weekend. At some point during that session, however, everything changed in a dark and disturbing way. One of the counselor cabins had been broken into, and inside, things had been disturbed. Personal belongings were moved around and scattered, and items were either taken or tossed aside. It wasn't a full-scale ransacking, but it was enough to be unsettling. Someone had clearly been there who wasn't supposed to be. As camp staff scoured the frightening scene, that's when they found the note. It had been left behind in an empty box of donuts. It was handwritten and terrifying in its simple and direct language. It said that whoever wrote it was planning to kill 3 girls in a tent. There was something else too. Not far from the cabin, someone had taken the time to put together a crude figure or effigy and hang it from a tree by a noose. Paired with the break-in and note, it made the whole thing incredibly creepy. At the same time though, there were some details that made the entire thing easy to dismiss. The note itself didn't read like something carefully thought out. Along with the threat, it included odd references to Martians and things that didn't make much sense. This made it feel more like a bad joke than a warning. It started to seem like the kind of thing someone might do to just get a reaction, and that's how it was all eventually treated. The break-in was written off, the note was thrown away, and the incident was chalked up to a prank. Maybe it was some local messing around, or maybe a bored counselor trying to scare her counterparts. Either way, it didn't seem serious enough to alter anything. No major security changes were made, and no one delayed the opening of the camp. Plans moved forward exactly as they had before, and by the time June rolled around, the whole thing had already started to fade into the background. On June 12th, 1977, Camp Scott came to life the way it did every summer. Buses rolled in from the Tulsa area, carrying more than 130 Girl Scouts ready to start the first 2-week session of the summer. The quiet of the wilderness was replaced by kids talking over each other and counselors calling out in all directions. It didn't take long for the place to feel full and alive. For a lot of the girls, though, this was their first real taste of being away from home, and you could see it in the way they stepped off the buses. Some were excited and some were unsure, but tried to act braver than they felt. Among the girls arriving that day were 3 who would end up sharing tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit. Lori was the youngest camper there that summer at just 8 years old. Michelle, who was 9, had been to Camp Scott before and had at least some idea of what to expect. Doris, meanwhile, who was 10 years old and went by her middle name Denise, was stepping into something completely new. She hadn't even been sure about coming in the first place. Two of her friends had backed out of the trip, and without them, the idea of spending days in an unfamiliar place with unfamiliar people didn't sit well with her. It even took some encouragement from her mother to convince her to go. Once Denise arrived though, the counselors made an effort to keep an eye on her to ensure that she didn't feel out of place. Denise was also the only black camper at Camp Scott that session, and it was something that didn't go unnoticed. The staff though tried to make sure she felt included and no different from any of the other girls that arrived that day. The three girls, Lori, Michelle, and Denise, had never met before that day, but like a lot of kids in that setting, they didn't stay strangers for long. They found themselves assigned to the same tent, along with a fourth camper who wasn't scheduled to arrive until the following day. So for that first night at camp, it would be just the three of them. Individually, they were all on the quieter side, but put together, they blended in with the rest of the camp without much trouble. And rather quickly, their tent was filled with just as much chatter and laughter as the others. As the evening went on, everyone gathered together for the first campfire. Songs were sung, introductions were made, and whatever nerves were still hanging around started to settle. It was the kind of night Camp Scott had seen countless times before, and the 1977 summer session couldn't have gotten off to a better start. Eventually, the fire burned down and the campers were sent back to their tents to get settled in for the night. Flashlights clicked on and off as kids joked around inside their tents or wrote in their journals, but eventually, one by one, the lights of Camp Scott went out. Once they did though, the entire scene changed. Without any artificial light, the darkness of the wilderness settled in completely. It wasn't like being in Tulsa, where there was always some glow of lights from somewhere. Out near Locust Grove, the darkness was total. Some girls would later say it was so dark that they couldn't tell if their eyes were open or closed. The sounds faded too, and what had been a loud, busy place just an hour earlier grew quiet as everyone drifted off to sleep. As the night wore on though, the stillness of the camp was broken. Sometime around 1:30 in the morning, a counselor named Carla heard something that immediately got her attention. It sounded like a faint moaning coming from somewhere nearby, from the direction of one of the tents. She then got up and stepped outside to check things out. Out in the darkness though, there wasn't much going on. There was no movement or clear source for the sound, and as quickly as it came on, it dissipated. The camp looked the same as it had before, and after a short time, with nothing obvious to point to, Carla went back inside her tent and fell asleep. That wouldn't be the end of the strange occurrences that night though. In a nearby tent, one of the campers woke up when she noticed someone standing at the entrance. The flap had been opened just enough for a flashlight beam to illuminate the darkness inside. For a moment, the light moved across the tent, then disappeared. The girl wasn't sure of what she had just seen, and she stayed where she was. Like a lot of kids in that situation, she didn't immediately raise an alarm. It was strange, but not something she could fully make sense of, so she too just went back to sleep. Around 3 a.m. though, the quiet was interrupted again, this time by a scream. It came from the direction of the Kiowa unit, and another camper would later say she heard someone crying out for their mother. The sound carried just enough to wake a few of the girls nearby. Once again though, there was hesitation by the campers. In the darkness, with no clear understanding of what was happening, those who heard it did what seemed easiest in the moment. They just stayed where they were. When the screams faded, so did the odd occurrences that night, and silence settled back over Camp Scott. Soon enough, morning came, and as the sun rose through the trees, the sounds of the camp waking up began to echo through the woods. In the Kiowa unit though, things were still quiet when Carla stepped out early and started walking toward the shower area to get ready for her day. As she walked along the trail in that direction, she noticed something strange just ahead of her. At first, she didn't register what it was. A shape was lying on the ground off the path, partially covered by a sleeping bag. For a moment, it looked like one of the girls had wandered out during the night and fallen asleep outside. It wasn't completely unheard of. Kids who were away from home for the first time sometimes did odd things at camp. But as Carla got closer to the object, it became clear that something wasn't right. It was Denise, and she was lying with most of her body on top of her sleeping bag. There was no movement and no sign that she was waking up or even aware of anything around her. It quickly became obvious that this wasn't a situation where someone had simply fallen asleep in the wrong place. Carla then turned and ran for help. She went back to get the camp director and the nurse, trying to explain what she had seen. At that point, the assumption wasn't necessarily that something terrible had happened. Maybe it was some kind of medical situation. When she returned to the scene with the others though, the situation became much clearer and much worse. They quickly realized that Denise wasn't alone. Just a short distance away, there were 2 more sleeping bags. At first glance, they looked empty or crumpled, but inside were Lori and Michelle. Both had been zipped into their respective bags, and all 3 girls were dead, having been finished in a violent fashion. Authorities were then called, and by mid-morning, the reality of what had happened was settling in for those who knew, but the rest of the Girl Scouts on the property were kept in the dark. Before noon, the campers were gathered up and told that they would be leaving early. Buses were arranged to take them back to Tulsa, and when they arrived back in the city that afternoon, the scene waiting for them made it obvious something terrible had happened. Parents had long since gathered and were anxious to pick their children up. Some were crying, and news cameras had started to show up to capture the scene. It was only when the children were back in the arms of their parents that they learned the truth about why camp ended so soon after it had started. As this was going on, investigators flooded Camp Scott to begin piecing things together. Authorities quickly concluded that the 3 girls had been attacked sometime after they went to sleep. Based on what was found at the scene and later confirmed in the autopsies, the violence had started inside tent number 8. Lori and Michelle were found to have passed from severe blows to the head. Denise had also been attacked, but in her case, the cause was strangulation. Horrifyingly, all 3 of them had also been assaulted in some way. Then after the attack, the bodies were moved. Each of them was placed into a sleeping bag, then carried out of the tent and left along the trail that led to the showers. It wasn't far, maybe 150 yards, but it was far enough that they were no longer immediately visible from the tent itself. Investigators also began documenting what had been left behind. Inside and around the tent, there were obvious signs of a struggle. The amount of blood alone told detectives that, but there was other evidence that would become crucial to putting together a picture of what happened, and more importantly, who might have done it. A footprint, later estimated to be from a size 9.5 shoe, had been left behind, and a large red flashlight was found near the bodies. On its lens was a smudged fingerprint, but not one clear enough to identify. The flashlight itself had also been altered and was packed with newspaper, apparently to keep the batteries from rattling around and making noise. A strip of tape was also placed over it to partially dim the beam. Nearby, other items turned up, including a rope, duct tape, and a pair of women's eyeglasses. Whoever had done this hadn't come unprepared, and as the search expanded beyond the immediate area, more discoveries followed. Not far from the camp, investigators located a cave that appeared to have been used as a kind of hideout or shelter by someone. Inside were groceries, photographs, newspapers, and additional duct tape matching that at the crime scene. The newspapers inside the cave also matched the pieces found inside the flashlight. But maybe most chilling of all, someone had written a message on the wall of the cave that read, quote, "The killer was here. Bye-bye, fools." The investigation then only ramped up in the days that followed. The scene itself offered pieces of the story, but none of what was found and recovered immediately gave authorities a clear answer on the course of events. What they did have, though, was a growing sense that whoever had done this knew the area. The terrain around Camp Scott wasn't easy to navigate if you weren't familiar with it. Dense woods and scattered back roads made it the kind of place where someone could move around without being seen, if they knew where they were going. That led investigators to start looking at people who already had ties to the region. For 10 long days, the public was fed bits and pieces of information during press conferences held by investigators, but behind the scenes, authorities already had a name. On June 23, 1977, they went public with it, announcing during a news conference that a man named Gene Leroy Hart had been charged with the killings. At the time, Gene was 33 years old, a local from the Locust Grove area, and already well known to law enforcement. In fact, police were already looking for Gene because he was on the run. Years earlier, he had been convicted of violent crimes, including the abduction and assault of 2 women, and later a series of burglaries. His sentences had added up to an astounding 308 years in prison, but despite that, he managed to escape custody not once, but twice. By the summer of 1977, he had been living as a fugitive for 4 years. That alone made him someone authorities were eager to find, but there was more. Gene had grown up in the area surrounding Camp Scott. He knew the woods, the terrain, and the back roads. Investigators believed that he would have been capable of moving through the area without drawing attention, possibly even living off the land if he needed to. Gene was also seemingly connected to the cave. It was a place Gene was known to be familiar with, and some of the items found there were believed to belong to him. Taken together, it was enough for authorities to act. To them, Gene fit the profile of what they were looking for. He had a background of violence and was familiar with the area, and in the view of investigators, there were pieces of physical evidence that helped place him nearby. Outside of law enforcement, though, not everyone was so convinced. For some people in Mays County, despite his history, Gene didn't seem capable of the senseless murders. He was someone they had grown up with and gone to high school with. Former teachers and classmates described him as quiet, respectful, and even well-liked. Their view of him didn't line up with the image of the man authorities were describing. Others, meanwhile, saw something else in the situation. Gene was a member of the Cherokee Nation, and there were concerns that he had been singled out, either because of his background or because he was already a known criminal who had embarrassed local law enforcement by escaping prison twice. But either way, from the standpoint of the investigation, authorities had their suspect. The only problem at this point was that he was nowhere to be found. Once Gene was named as the primary suspect, law enforcement agencies from across the region got involved, and before long, the effort had grown into the largest manhunt Oklahoma had seen at the time. Search teams pushed into the Cookson Hills, dogs were brought in, and aircraft flew overhead. Volunteers also joined the effort, combing through areas that law enforcement alone couldn't cover fast enough. But even with all of that, Gene stayed far out of reach. For a while, it seemed possible that Gene might never be found, but then nearly a year after the murders, agents with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation acted on a tip and made their way to a remote shack in the Cookson Hills. The property was owned by a Cherokee medicine man, and when authorities arrived on April 6, 1978, Gene was there and taken into custody. Investigators then had to take everything they had gathered and turn it into something that would hold up in court, and some of the evidence was particularly strong. There were items found in the cave that were linked both to the murder scene and Gene himself. Hair samples and other material recovered from the scene were analyzed, and experts believed that the results were consistent with Gene. There was a limit to how far it could go, though. This was years before DNA testing would become standard. In the late 1970s, the science could suggest a match, but it couldn't confirm one with certainty, and that became a problem. Even some within the investigation acknowledged that there was no single piece of evidence that placed Gene inside tent number 8 at the time of the murders. What they had instead was a collection of details that, when viewed together, pointed in his direction. By the time Gene went to trial in March of 1979, the case had already taken on a life of its own. People lined up hours before the courtroom doors opened, hoping to get a seat. The murders had shaken the region, and now, nearly 2 years later, this was supposed to be the moment of resolution. Gene entered the courtroom, though, looking nothing like what many people expected. He wore a dark blue suit and was neatly put together. He carried himself in a calm, controlled way, and there was nothing outwardly aggressive about him. If anything, his appearance worked in his favor. He didn't look like someone on trial for something this violent. To some, he came across more like a teacher or business professional than a defendant, and this helped him garner more support from the community. The prosecution presented its case first, and they put together all the individual pieces that painted Gene as guilty. Even despite the uncertainty of the biological evidence, it was a strong picture, but when the defense began its case, things started to shift. Instead of trying to explain everything away, Gene's defense team focused on the investigation itself. From their perspective, how the evidence had been gathered and interpreted was problematic. They questioned the reliability of the forensic work and challenged whether the items found in the cave could truly be tied to Gene in any kind of meaningful way. They even raised the possibility that some of the evidence had been mishandled or planted. More than anything, though, they leaned into the idea that authorities had made up their minds that Gene was the killer early on. Over the course of 10 days, the two sides wrapped up their cases and presented their closing arguments. Things were then handed over to the jury on March 29th, and they spent several hours that day going over what they had heard. When they returned the next morning, it took only 30 minutes more of deliberation to reach a unanimous verdict. Once the jury returned to the courtroom and the charges were read one by one, all of them were followed by a verdict of not guilty. The reaction from those in attendance in the courtroom was divided. Some people let out cheers while others sat in silence, trying to process what they had just heard. And outside the courtroom, the response was just as divided. There were those who believed the system had worked exactly as it was supposed to, and that the state had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. There were just as many who saw it differently, though. Law enforcement in particular were stunned by the verdict, as they had no doubt that Gene was guilty of the killings. Regardless, though, Gene would walk out of the courtroom that day having been acquitted. Even so, he wasn't a free man. Because of his previous convictions, he was returned to prison to continue serving what remained of a sentence that still stood in excess of 300 years. Then on June 4th, 1979, Gene's time in prison came to an abrupt end. Just 2 months after his acquittal, Gene had been in the prison yard that day and spent about an hour lifting weights and jogging. At some point during that time, he collapsed and died. He was just 35 years old, and it was determined that he had passed from a massive heart attack. The case of the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders was already one with so many questions left unanswered, and now the person at the center of it all was gone. Whatever answers Gene might have had, if he had any at all, were gone with him. A few days later, his funeral was held in Locust Grove, and the turnout was significant. An estimated 1,000 people showed up, and it was enough that the service had to be held in a high school gymnasium to accommodate them all. For years after the trial, the case sat in a kind of standstill. There were no new arrests or major breakthroughs in the investigation. Authorities maintained that they had pursued the right suspect. The court, however, had reached a different decision, so without anything new to move the case forward, it remained right where it was. Over time, though, the tools available to examine the evidence began to change. By the late 1980s, DNA testing was starting to become part of criminal investigations. It wasn't as advanced as it would later become, but it offered the ability to compare biological evidence with a level of precision that earlier methods couldn't match. In 1989, evidence from the case was tested again, but once again, the results didn't provide an answer. Some of the findings were consistent with Gene, but they weren't strong enough to draw a definitive conclusion. Statistically, the results could apply to a relatively small group of people that included Gene, but not just one person. Then in 2017, renewed interest led to a new push for testing. Funding was raised to apply more advanced forensic methods with the hope that something meaningful could be pulled from the evidence. This time, the results came back with a bit more clarity. In 2022, authorities announced that the latest testing strongly suggested a link to Gene. While it still didn't produce a complete DNA profile that could conclusively identify him as the source, the findings were enough to rule out several other individuals who had been considered over the years. The only one who couldn't be ruled out was in fact Gene. However, for now, a definitive answer depends on time and technology, and that's where things stand today. As for Camp Scott, it closed on June 13th, 1977, and it was never reopened.